Do you ever think about those African American recipes from the 70s that only Black families knew? These recipes shaped daily life because they were taught in small kitchens and carried the taste of family. What else have we kept close without realizing how much it still lives in us? Stewed chicken with onions and gravy was one of those Sunday meals that told you exactly what kind of week Grandma had without her saying a single word. If the pot was full, she must have had a little extra energy. If the pot was stretched thin and mostly gravy, then she had probably spent the whole week trying to make life behave. Either way, nobody complained, because that smell alone could make people line up in the kitchen doorway like they were waiting for concert tickets. The onions softened down to almost nothing, melting into the broth until the whole pot turned the color of late afternoon sunshine. Grandma would let the chicken simmer low and slow, using the kind of patience adults today only pretend to have. By the time it was done, the meat slid right off the bone. The gravy clung to the rice like it had been born there, and everyone knew to grab a plate before the cousins wiped the pot clean. Stewed chicken like this did not come from a recipe card. It came from knowing how to turn one bird into enough food for everyone sitting at the table and a few folks who showed up uninvited. It tasted like family, like improvising, like doing the absolute most with whatever you had in the fridge. And that is exactly why it stayed in so many Black households through the 70s. It was a meal that never judged you for being tired or broke or late to dinner. It simply welcomed you home. Neckbone and rice was the dish that taught entire generations the real meaning of the phrase, "make do." You could always tell who grew up eating it based on how quickly they nodded when someone mentioned neck bones, like they were remembering a whole childhood at once. They were cheap, overlooked, and sitting quietly in the grocery store while everyone else fought over the fancier cuts. But in the hands of a 70s Black grandmother, neck bones became something tender, savory, and deeply comforting. Simmered until the meat pulled away with barely a nudge. The pot would bubble on the back burner for hours, filling the house with a scent that felt like love disguised as steam. Rice was the great equalizer, the thing that turned a pot of odds and ends into a full meal, stretching flavor the way families stretched paychecks. When Grandma stirred everything together, it felt like she was stirring memories, turning a simple cut of meat into something unforgettable. Children who claimed they did not like neck bones would somehow finish 2 bowls without blinking. Adults pretended they did not fight over the last piece, even though everyone knew the truth. Neck bone and rice was never fancy, never written down, never served to impress company. It lived in weeknights, in winter evenings, in quiet kitchens where women created magic out of bones and broth, and that is exactly why it stayed. Because sometimes the best meals are the ones that only make sense if you lived them. Butter beans with smoked turkey tails were the kind of dish that did not need an introduction, because the smell alone handled all the talking. These beans had roots deep in the South, but by the time the 1970s rolled around, they had made themselves comfortable in city apartments from Detroit to Chicago to Newark. Butter beans are funny that way. They look humble, but once they sit with smoked turkey tails for a few hours, they transform into something rich, silky, and full of stories. Grandma would dump everything into the pot with the kind of confidence that comes from years of feeding crowds without a single complaint. The turkey tails added that deep smoky flavor you could never get from seasoning packets pretending to know what they were doing. The beans softened until they were creamy, soaking up every bit of flavor like they had been training their whole lives for this one pot. Families gathered around these bowls because butter beans were filling, reliable, and perfect for stretching a grocery budget that needed to last longer than it should have. No holiday was required, no special occasion needed. Butter beans were the occasion. They tasted like the kind of comfort that made people close their eyes with the first bite, and that alone made them a 70s memory worth keeping. Pan-fried whiting with cornmeal coating was the closest thing a family could get to a seafood feast without spending more than a few dollars. And honestly, nobody felt like they were missing anything. Whiting fillets showed up in Friday kitchens like clockwork, thawing quietly on a plate, while Grandma prepared the cornmeal like she was gearing up for battle. Every Black household had their own way of seasoning it, and every single one swore theirs was the correct way. The fish hit the hot oil with a crackle that made even the teenagers pause long enough to see if a piece was ready to steal. Whiting cooked fast, crisping into golden fillets that somehow disappeared faster than Grandma could pull them out of the pan. The cornmeal coating gave it that perfect crunch, the kind that made you think about grabbing a second piece before you finished the first. You ate it with hot sauce if you were grown, with white bread if you were young, and with quiet appreciation if you were smart. In the 70s, fried whiting was not just a meal. It was a tradition, a routine, a weekly promise that no matter how wild life got, Friday dinner would be good. And sometimes, good was more than enough. Canned salmon croquettes with hot sauce were the kind of meal you always remembered, even if you pretended you did not. Canned salmon was affordable, dependable, and sitting in every pantry like a silent backup singer waiting for its solo. Grandma would pop the can open, drain the liquid with one quick flick of her wrist, and mix the salmon with onions, eggs, and crumbs using measurements only she understood. She shaped the patties like she had done it 1,000 times, which she had, and let them sizzle in the pan until the edges turned a deep, crispy, brown hot sauce went on the table automatically, because everyone knew the croquettes were not complete without that extra kick. These patties were soft on the inside, crunchy on the outside, and somehow held the entire essence of 70s survival cooking in one bite. Children loved them, adults relied on them, and families built whole memories around something that technically came from a can but tasted like care. No recipe card existed for croquettes like these. They existed in the hands that made them, and those hands taught generations how to turn humble ingredients into food that felt like pride. Hot water cornbread patties were the kind of recipe that made sense only if you had watched someone make them. Grandma never explained it. She just grabbed a bowl, dumped in cornmeal, poured in boiling water, and stirred with the kind of certainty that suggested measuring cups were invented for people with too much free time. She shaped the patties with quick, practiced movements and dropped them into hot oil with a confidence that would make modern cooks rethink every appliance they own. The patties puffed slightly, crisped around the edges, and came out tasting like pure comfort. They were cheap, quick, and absolutely perfect with greens, beans, or honestly, with nothing at all. In the 70s, these patties showed up on tables when money was tight, when time was short, or when Grandma simply felt like making something that reminded her of home. Hot water cornbread never needed to be written down because it lived in muscle memory. Passed from hand to hand like a secret, you learned only by showing up in the kitchen at the right moment. And once you tasted it, you understood why families kept the tradition alive. Smothered pork chops over white rice were the kind of meal that made people stop mid-sentence just to appreciate what was happening on their plate. Grandma browned the chops first, letting the aroma drift through the house like a warning that dinner was about to get serious. Then came the onions, the broth, the slow simmer that turned the pan drippings into a gravy so good it could make you forget whatever nonsense you dealt with all week. The gravy mattered as much as the meat, maybe more, because it soaked into the rice until the whole bowl tasted like pure satisfaction. In the 1970s, this dish was more than comfort. It was celebration. It was payday. It was Sunday after church. Families leaned over their plates, scooping up every bit of rice and gravy like they did not want to miss a single detail. No cookbook captured this dish the way Black families cooked it. It was instinctive, emotional, and built from the desire to feed people well, even when the world outside felt unkind. And that is why it stayed in the memory of anyone lucky enough to taste it. Okra and tomatoes with bacon drippings was the dish that told you where your people came from even if you had never been there yourself. It carried Southern memory straight into the kitchens of families who had moved north for new work and new beginnings. Grandma would slice the okra, sauté it in bacon drippings, then fold in tomatoes until everything blended into a pot of silky, tangy, smoky goodness that tasted like history. People who claimed they did not like okra somehow cleaned their plates when Grandma made it because she understood how to coax out the best parts of the vegetable without apologizing for its texture. In the 70s, this dish showed up next to rice, cornbread, or whatever else needed a partner. It was never fancy, never expensive, but it was always dependable. Okra and tomatoes belonged to a past that Black families carried forward without fanfare, and every bite tasted like a reminder of who taught them how to make something from very little. Pig feet stew with vinegar and pepper was one of those recipes that younger generations like to act shy about, even though everybody knew the truth. If you grew up with an elder who made it right, you probably loved it. Pig feet were cheap, plentiful, and overlooked by anyone who did not understand the art of slow cooking. But Black grandmothers understood. They cleaned them, seasoned them, simmered them for hours, and added vinegar and pepper until the whole stew tasted like a warm, tangy, deeply seasoned hug. Families ate this dish without ceremony, usually with white bread or rice, sitting wherever there was space because nobody waited for a formal table setting. It was survival food, heritage food, and comfort food all rolled into one dish that almost never appeared in a cookbook. And that is exactly why it stayed alive in 70s kitchens, because it lived in the elders, not the pages. Chicken gizzards, fried, golden, and crispy, were proof that Black cooking in the 70s could turn the most underestimated ingredient into something crave-worthy. Gizzards looked intimidating to anyone who did not grow up around them, but once Grandma seasoned them and dropped them into hot oil, they became a whole different story. The crunch was loud, the flavor was bold, and the plate emptied faster than anyone expected. These gizzards were eaten as a snack, a meal, or something to nibble on while standing in the kitchen waiting for the main event to finish cooking. The seasoning changed from house to house, but the love behind them did not. They represented a time when families made greatness out of what they had, not what they wished for, and in a decade full of change, fried gizzards stayed exactly the same in all the best ways. Collard greens cooked with ham hocks were the kind of pot that told you everything you needed to know about the day ahead before you even rubbed the sleep out of your eyes. If Grandma had those greens simmering by lunchtime, you already knew somebody was stopping by, or somebody had already stopped by, or somebody was about to stop by and she wanted the house to smell right when they did. The greens wilted slow, turning tender only after they had soaked up every bit of flavor from those ham hocks sitting in the bottom like they owned the place. The broth turned silky and smoky, and the whole pot tasted like somebody took history, love, and a little bit of struggle and let them simmer until everything felt steady again. These greens were not rushed. You could not hurry them or distract them or try to make them something they were not. They cooked on their own time, the same way Grandma lived on hers. By dinner, the house smelled like a gathering, whether anyone had planned one or not. A spoonful of those greens tasted like the South carried into the 70s, like porch conversations tucked inside steaming bowls, like memories handed down without needing a single written word. That is why they lived in every Black kitchen worth its salt, because they tasted like family. Red beans slow-cooked with sausage coins were the kind of weekday dinner that proved you did not need much to eat well. You just needed time, a pot, and a little patience that somehow only grandmothers seemed to have in endless supply. These beans did not look like much when they started, little dry specks soaking in water, waiting to come alive. But after hours on the back burner, they softened into something rich, hearty, and full of quiet flavor. The sausage coins were never the star, just the supporting cast that showed up to add a little smokiness and stretch the pot far enough to make sure every bowl was full. In the 70s, meals like this kept families fed when paychecks were unpredictable, and groceries had to last longer than anyone wanted to admit. The beans thickened as they cooked, turning into the kind of comfort that sat heavy on your spoon and warm in your chest. Served over rice, they were a full meal, a survival tool, and a hug in a bowl. Nobody needed to talk much when red beans were on the table because the food had already said everything. Cabbage fried with smoked sausage was a one-pan miracle that showed up in kitchens when weeks were tight, fridges were almost empty, and families needed something hearty that did not complain about being made out of whatever was left. Grandma would chop cabbage with the same speed she used when she did not want anyone asking questions about dinner. She sliced the smoked sausage thin so it could flavor every bite without needing a whole pack. And then everything hit the pan with a sizzle that made the house smell like dinner was going to be all right after all. The cabbage softened, soaking up the sausage drippings like it had been waiting all week for its moment. A little pepper, a little salt, maybe a pinch of sugar if Grandma felt like being generous, and suddenly that humble pan had turned into a feast. In the 70s, this dish fed families without drawing any attention to how practical it was. It tasted filling, familiar, and comforting, the kind of meal that made you sit down and breathe for a moment. You did not brag about cabbage and sausage, but you remembered it. Black skillet cornbread with bacon grease was the kind of cornbread that proved the skillet was not just cookware, it was an heirloom with more authority than half the adults in the house. Grandma would heat that skillet until it hummed, pour in the bacon grease, and let it bubble like it was getting ready to preach. When the batter hit the pan, the edges crisped instantly, forming that perfect golden ring you could spot from across the room. No recipe card existed for this cornbread because nobody needed one. The measurements lived in the wrist, in the tilt of the bowl, in the memory of watching someone older stir batter until it felt right. When the skillet came out of the oven, the cornbread cracked on top like it had been kissed by every ancestor who ever stood over a hot stove. It never required butter, never asked for honey, never begged for attention. It simply held its own. In the 70s, this was the cornbread you served with everything that mattered, and everyone knew it. Sardine and mustard sandwiches were the kind of quick lunch that older Black families ate long before anybody on television started calling canned fish a trend. These sandwiches were born out of practicality, convenience, and the kind of taste buds that understand flavor better than budgets. Grandma would mash the sardines with just the right amount of mustard, spreading the mixture thick onto soft white bread that stuck to the roof of your mouth in the best possible way. Sometimes she added onions, sometimes she did not. It just depended on how bold she felt that day. This sandwich was cheap, filling, and always waiting for you after school or on a busy Saturday when nobody felt like cooking. In the 70s, kids pretended to turn their noses up, but they ate the whole thing anyway because sardines had a way of tasting better than you expected every single time. It was not fancy. It was not pretty, but it was home. Potato cakes made from leftover mash were the kind of recipe that happened because Grandma refused to waste a single thing in her kitchen, not even the potatoes from last night's dinner. She would take the cold mash, mix in a little flour, an egg, maybe some seasonings she never told anyone about, and shape the mixture into little patties that fried up golden and crisp. These cakes had the kind of crunch that made you forget they were made from leftovers, and the inside stayed soft and creamy like they had just been whipped fresh. In the 70s, these cakes were a survival snack, a breakfast side, a quick lunch, or whatever else the day demanded. Kids grabbed them with their hands. Adults ate them quietly over the sink. Nobody waited for permission. Potato cakes tasted like resourcefulness, like stretching food the way families stretched paychecks, like making something delicious out of something forgotten. And that is why people still crave them today. Baked chicken legs with paprika and onion soup mix were the kind of everyday miracle that made the whole house smell like someone had spent hours cooking, even when Grandma barely had time to breathe. Chicken legs were affordable, seasoned easily, and baked beautifully, making them a 70s staple in households trying to feed a lot of people without making a big deal out of it. Grandma would sprinkle paprika until the chicken looked dressed for church, pour that onion soup mix over the top like she was sprinkling blessings, and slide the pan into the oven with a confidence that told you it was about to be good. The legs baked until the skin turned crisp in some spots, soft in others, and the pan juices formed a gravy that made the rice disappear faster than the chicken. This dish was not fancy, but it was dependable, delicious, and always welcome. And in a decade of constant change, dependable meals mattered. Banana pudding with meringue was once a favorite at family gatherings, layered with homemade custard, vanilla wafers, and sliced bananas, then crowned with fluffy meringue. African-American cooks elevated this dish by topping it with browned meringue rather than whipped cream, which gave it elegance without added expense. The custard was cooked slowly on the stove, thickened with eggs and milk until silky, then poured over layers of cookies and fruit. The meringue was whipped by hand until stiff, spread across the top, and baked just long enough to turn golden. Families valued it because it made a modest amount of bananas feed a crowd while still tasting indulgent. It was often served at church dinners, where its airy topping drew eyes before the first spoonful was taken. The pudding was sweet, creamy, and soft, with the crunch of cookies softened into the mix. Today, instant mixes have replaced the homemade versions, but they lack the patience and pride of the original. Banana pudding with meringue was once a centerpiece of gatherings, treasured for its taste and presentation. Turkey necks with gravy turned what many ignored into something worth craving. Grandparents browned the necks first, letting them sizzle in a pan until the air filled with a smoky richness. A bit of flour, water, and thyme turned the drippings into thick brown gravy that coated every piece like velvet. The meat cooked for hours until it slipped clean off the bone, tender and rich with flavor. Served over rice or mashed potatoes, it looked simple but tasted like a feast. The necks may have been cheap, but the love behind them was priceless. Grandparents made the most of what they had, and this meal proved their creativity and care. The gravy was the best part, seasoned just right, spooned generously so nothing went to waste. Everyone at the table ate slow, grateful for the warmth, the smell, and the moment. It was Sunday flavor on a weekday budget, the taste of making do without feeling poor. Turkey necks with gravy were more than a meal. They were a celebration of resilience and resourcefulness that lived in every kitchen where pride cooked alongside hunger. Turkey wing pot roast turned thrift into triumph, stretching a few wings into a meal that could feed many. Grandma browned them first, the skin crisping under the heat before she laid them into the pan with carrots, onions, and potatoes. A little water, a pinch of spice, and thyme did the rest. Hours later, the kitchen smelled like heaven, rich, savory, and full of promise. The meat fell from the bone with the gentlest touch, the gravy glistening across the vegetables. It was not expensive, but it was everything a meal should be, filling, flavorful, and full of care. Families gathered, hungry and happy, their plates warm and their spirits lifted. Turkey wing pot roast was proof that even the least celebrated parts could shine when cooked with love. It was patience turned into flavor, comfort baked into tradition, and every bite whispered that nothing made by hand was ever humble. Gizzards and rice were the meal that taught flavor from labor. Tough at first, the gizzards demanded patience, cleaned, boiled, and seasoned before ever touching the skillet. Grandparents fried them slow with onions, letting the scent of pepper and grease build into something irresistible. Once tender, they met a pot of rice, plain but proud, soaking up all that savory juice. It was not fancy, but it was rich in spirit, feeding families that refused to waste a thing. Gizzards, the part most people threw away, became the centerpiece of a dinner that stuck to the ribs. The sound of the knife chopping, the hiss of the pan, the quiet hum of the stove, all of it felt like music in a home where nothing came easy but everything was earned. It was dinner built from wisdom, not wealth. Each bite carried gratitude and grit, proof that poverty never lacked flavor. Stewed chicken with dumplings was the kind of meal that gathered everyone close. The chicken, simple and seasoned, boiled gently until it gave all its flavor to the broth. Dumplings, cut by hand from scraps of dough, floated on top like little clouds soaking in every drop of goodness. It was thick, rich, and warm enough to chase away any cold day. This was the kind of food made in one pot, where the smell alone was enough to make children set the table without being told. Each bite carried comfort and care, a reminder that love was often found in the simplest meals. The broth would bubble slow, carrying the scent of herbs, flour, and memory all at once. It was food for healing, for comfort, for hope when times were thin. Stewed chicken and dumplings were proof that good food didn't come from plenty. It came from patience, skill, and heart. Fried bologna sandwiches were the weeknight heroes of the kitchen. Bologna hit the hot skillet with a sizzle, the edges curling like petals as it browned. Grandparents flipped each slice just once, careful not to burn the good parts. The smell was sharp, salty, and rich, filling the house faster than the hunger could. White bread waited on the counter, sometimes toasted, sometimes soft, and mustard or hot sauce turned it into magic. When money ran short, this sandwich saved the day. It was fast, filling, and full of character. Kids loved the crunch at the edge, the way the heat softened the bread just enough to make it melt in your hands. Grown folks knew it for what it was, a humble blessing. Fried bologna sandwiches tasted like memory and invention, like comfort built on what little was left. Rice and gravy suppers were the soul of weeknight dinners, simple and satisfying. Grandparents browned whatever they had, chicken scraps, neck bones, or even onions alone, to make a base for the gravy. The drippings told the story, turning flour and water into gold. The smell was deep and comforting, rising from the pan like a promise. Hot rice waited patiently in a pot nearby, ready to soak up every drop. It was not fancy, but it was enough to fill every stomach and calm every worry. The first spoonful always tasted like home, salty and rich, carrying the flavor of care. When times were lean, the gravy was thin, but the love stayed thick. Every plate was scraped clean, nothing left behind. It was the dinner that kept families steady, warm, and thankful. Proof that comfort did not need luxury, just a stove, some rice, and a little faith. It fed more than hunger. It fed hope. Grandparents knew that a good pot of gravy could fix most of life's small troubles. Sometimes it was made with leftover roast or chicken drippings saved from the night before. Other times it was built from nothing more than fat and flour, stirred until the color turned perfect. The magic was in the patience, the slow whisk, the right smell, the moment it thickened. In that moment, the kitchen turned into a place of peace. Canned sardine grits bowls were a dish for days when the cupboard seemed empty, but the will to eat well remained strong. Grandparents opened the tin, the sharp, salty scent of sardines hitting first. They fried the fish lightly in the skillet with onions or peppers if they had them, crisping the edges until golden. Meanwhile, a pot of grits bubbled on the stove, thick and smooth, stirred with a heavy hand to keep it from sticking. The two came together in a bowl, grits soft and buttery beneath, sardines rich and smoky on top. Hot sauce was often the final touch, adding just enough heat to balance the salt. It was a poor man's meal with a rich man's satisfaction, a combination that made sense only to those who had lived it. For many families, it was breakfast, dinner, and survival, proof that pride and creativity never left the kitchen, no matter how hard times got. Candied yams cooked down until syrupy were the side dish that stole the spotlight every single time, even when they were supposed to behave quietly on the edge of the plate. Grandma sliced the yams thick, added butter, sugar, cinnamon, and sometimes a drop of vanilla, then let them cook until they glistened like amber, the sauce thickened into a rich syrup that clung to every slice. In the 70's, candied yams were a signature dish made with pride and perfected across generations. They were the kind of food everyone looked for first, even before the ham or the turkey. They tasted like sweetness earned through patience, like something crafted with love and meant to be remembered long after the plate was cleared. Hamburger stew with potatoes, carrots, and peas was the kind of budget meal that got families through long weeks when groceries needed to stretch farther than anyone liked to admit. Ground beef browned quickly, vegetables filled the pot, and everything simmered together until it became a thick, hearty stew perfect for ladling over rice or eating with crusty bread. It warmed the belly, comforted the spirit, and gave families a sense of plenty when times were lean. In the 70's, hamburger stew showed up often, and nobody complained. It carried the kind of flavor that told you effort mattered more than cost, and the leftovers somehow tasted even better the next day. It tasted like getting by with dignity, like making the most out of what you had, and never letting the table feel empty. Ground kudzu root paste emerged when conventional flours were scarce, and starchy substitutes were needed to thicken stews or stretch breads. Kudzu, an invasive vine introduced from Asia, sent deep roots into the southern soil that stored abundant starch. Enslaved gatherers dug these roots, washed and dried them, then pounded them into a fine powder. Mixed with water, the powder formed a paste that thickened soups or acted as a binder for cornmeal cakes. Its mild flavor and reliable texture made it a quiet but important ingredient in times of scarcity. After emancipation, some rural families continued to harvest kudzu for its starch, and today herbalists still value it for its medicinal qualities. Ground kudzu root paste shows how knowledge of local plants and persistence in foraging allowed cooks to replace costly ingredients with what the land freely offered, turning an aggressive vine into a vital pantry staple, and demonstrating again how necessity inspired both culinary creativity and a deeper understanding of the southern landscape's hidden gifts. Molasses stacked cake graced weddings and homecomings with a sweetness born of patience and skill. Thin layers of spiced cake were baked individually, then stacked high with a rich molasses filling that soaked into the crumb as the dessert rested overnight. The dark syrup lent a deep flavor that spoke of both Caribbean cane fields and southern kitchens. Families often baked the layers days ahead, turning the assembly into a festive gathering where aunts and cousins worked side by side. Each slice told a story of celebration and endurance, for molasses was affordable and plentiful even when other sweeteners were scarce. The cake's tall, impressive stature made it a centerpiece on tables decorated for special occasions, a symbol of abundance even in lean times. Today, few households take the time to roll, bake, and stack so many delicate layers, and the recipe lives mostly in old family cookbooks. Those who have tasted it know the quiet triumph of a dessert that rewards effort with lasting memory. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Black-eyed pea salad was the cool breeze of the dinner table. It started as a way to use up leftovers from the pot of peas cooked the night before, but it became its own tradition. The peas were chilled, mixed with onions, bell peppers, and a drizzle of vinegar, then left to marinate until every bite had a kick. It was light but filling, tangy but balanced, and always refreshing on hot summer days. Grandparents made it for picnics, church gatherings, or just to stretch food a little farther. Every spoonful was bright, flavorful, and full of texture. It reminded people that nothing needed to be wasted when creativity led the kitchen. That's how survival became flavor and thrift became art. It was more than a side. It was a lesson in making something beautiful from what you already had. Served cold from an enamel bowl or mason jar, it brought a spark of freshness to plates filled with rich meats and cornbread. The vinegar's bite cut through the heat, and the crisp vegetables gave it life. Kids didn't always understand how simple it was, they just knew it tasted good. But for the older hands who made it, it was about pride, discipline, and the joy of making abundance out of what others overlooked. Mulberry leaf wraps transformed young, tender leaves from the wild mulberry tree into clever edible packages. Foragers selected the freshest leaves in spring when they were soft and mild, then blanched them briefly to soften their texture. Cooked rice, seasoned vegetables, or small bits of preserved fish were spooned inside before the leaves were folded and steamed, creating tidy bundles filled with subtle, earthy flavor. This technique echoed African traditions of wrapping foods in leaves for both cooking and preservation, blending seamlessly with indigenous American practices. The result was a portable meal that required no extra containers and made use of a tree that also provided sweet berries later in the season. After emancipation, mulberry leaves continued to appear in Southern folk remedies and tea blends, but the memory of leaf-wrapped suppers remains a quiet testament to ingenuity. Mulberry leaf wraps illustrate how a single plant could meet many needs, offering nourishment, flavor, and practicality to communities that transformed every part of their environment into sustenance. Homemade Cracklin bread filled kitchens with the savory perfume of pork fat and toasted cornmeal. Families saved every scrap of rendered pork skin, frying it until crisp and then folding the cracklings into cornbread batter rich with buttermilk and a touch of lard. Baked in a well-seasoned skillet, the bread emerged with a crisp crust and pockets of salty crunch that delighted children and elders alike. It was a dish born of necessity, ensuring nothing from the hog went to waste, but it also became a treat that people looked forward to at Sunday dinners. Neighbors often traded cracklings after a hog killing, turning the preparation into a social event that celebrated thrift and flavor. Today, store-bought cornbread mixes rarely capture the depth or texture of the old-style Cracklin bread, and few families still render their own pork. For those who have tasted it, the memory of that smoky, savory slice remains a reminder of community resourcefulness and the joy of making something extraordinary from humble ingredients. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, she split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. Mustard greens with hot sauce were the bold cousin of collards. They had bite, both in taste and in spirit. The greens were boiled down until tender, then seasoned with salt, pepper, and sometimes a touch of smoked meat. A splash of hot sauce at the end turned the pot from ordinary to electric. It woke up the senses and cut through the heaviness of fried food like nothing else could. Grandparents loved the balance, the bitterness of the greens, the heat of the sauce, and the comfort of cornbread soaking up the broth. It was simple but defiant, food that stood tall in its flavor. Eating it felt like strength on a plate. The tang hit first, then the spice rolled in slow, leaving you warm and awake. It wasn't fancy cooking, it was honesty, fire, and tradition. The kind of dish that cleared sinuses and souls alike. Families gathered around bowls of mustard greens, laughing, sweating, and reaching for seconds. It was a shared experience, something rough, real, and necessary. When food was scarce, these greens reminded you that life still had bite, and so did you. Goosefoot seed meal offered vital nourishment when cultivated grains were scarce or too costly. Goosefoot, also known as lamb's quarters, grew abundantly along field edges and yielded tiny seeds rich in protein and minerals. Enslaved harvesters shook the plants over cloths to collect the seeds, then winnowed and ground them into a fine flour. This flour could be cooked into hot cereal, mixed with cornmeal for bread, or used to thicken stews, providing a surprisingly hearty alternative to purchased grain. The practice drew on both African and indigenous traditions of using wild seeds as staple foods. Even after emancipation, rural families in parts of the Midwest and Appalachia continued to gather goosefoot seeds for their high nutritional value. Modern interest in quinoa, which is a close relative, echoes this old wisdom. Goosefoot seed meal stands as a reminder that careful attention to the landscape and patient handwork could turn what many considered weeds into a dependable source of strength and nourishment that kept families fed through the hardest seasons. Boiled peanuts turned the simplest crop into a roadside delicacy beloved across the coastal South. Green peanuts fresh from the field were boiled in salty water for hours until their shells softened and the kernels inside became tender and briny. Travelers stopped at roadside stands where pots steamed and the scent of salt filled the warm air. Vendors scooped the peanuts into paper bags dripping with flavorful liquid, and families ate them hot while driving or sitting on porches in the evening. The snack offered both nourishment and entertainment as friends cracked shells and talked late into the night. Farmers appreciated the way boiled peanuts made use of young harvests that might not keep for roasting. Although convenience stores sell packaged versions, the true experience of a freshly boiled peanut eaten outdoors remains unmatched, carrying the taste of red clay fields, summer humidity, and the easy rhythm of Southern hospitality shared one shell at a time. Tell us which tradition you'd bring back, like this video if the memories made you hungry, and subscribe to keep these rich flavors alive. Turnip greens with salt pork had a depth of flavor only time and care could create. The greens simmered slowly until tender, flavored by chunks of salt pork that gave off a richness no seasoning could match. Grandparents made them in big pots, stirring occasionally, tasting often, and trusting their instincts. The broth that gathered at the bottom, the potlikker, was gold. It was sopped up with cornbread, never wasted, because that's where all the goodness lived. This dish told a story of endurance, of families who turned scarcity into flavor and routine into ritual. Every pot was a reminder of resilience passed down generation by generation. Even now, a forkful of those greens tastes like history, salty, smoky, soulful, and true. Smoked frog legs provided unexpected protein from the marshes and bayous surrounding many southern plantations. Skilled foragers caught frogs at night with simple nets or by hand, cleaning the meaty hind legs and seasoning them with salt and wild herbs before smoking them slowly over hickory coals. The gentle smoke preserved the meat for days and gave it a rich, savory flavor that paired well with cornbread or greens. This practice echoed West African traditions of smoking small game and fish to ensure longevity in hot climates. After emancipation, smoked frog legs remained a regional delicacy in Louisiana and coastal communities, later becoming a celebrated dish in Cajun cuisine. They remind us that survival often required deep familiarity with the waterways and a willingness to turn overlooked resources into sustaining meals. Smoked frog legs stand as an example of how necessity and skill created flavors that outlasted hardship, transforming what began as a pragmatic hunt into a distinctive part of Southern culinary heritage and a taste still enjoyed today. Fried green tomato. Po' boys turned unripe tomatoes into a sandwich that tasted like pure coastal sunshine wrapped in crunchy cornmeal. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried until their edges crisped and their centers softened just enough to release a bright tang. Piled high on soft French bread with a smear of remoulade and a handful of shredded lettuce, they became a favorite along Gulf Coast streets where shrimp boats docked and music floated from open windows. Vendors often sold them at fish fries and fairs when seafood prices climbed too high, proving that a garden vegetable could carry the day as well as any oyster or crab. Families remembered the scent of hot oil and the pop of cornmeal batter while waiting in line for a sandwich that blended thrift and celebration. Today, fast food counters try to imitate the flavor, but they cannot capture the quiet magic of fresh garden tomatoes picked before ripening, fried in backyard kitchens, and shared among neighbors who knew the value of every bite. Fish head stew was a dish born out of necessity, yet it carried surprising depth and flavor. Fish heads, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and rice until they yielded every ounce of richness to the broth. My grandmother insisted the heads made the stew better than fillets, providing body and nourishment that nothing else could. The bones and skin flavored the liquid until it turned hearty and comforting. Potatoes stretched the meal, rice thickened it, and vegetables added substance, turning scraps into a filling supper. The taste was strong, earthy, and unforgettable, reminding everyone that no part of food should go unused. For Black families in the 1960s, fish head stew was a common way to stretch the catch of the day, ensuring nothing went to waste. It became a lesson in thrift and gratitude, proof that survival demanded creativity. Fish head stew was both humble and mighty, sustaining families through lean times with flavor and tradition. Macaroni salad with egg and relish was the dish that showed up at every gathering. Cold, creamy, and a little tangy, it was made to be shared. The macaroni was boiled until soft, then mixed with chopped boiled eggs, sweet relish, and a spoonful of mayonnaise. A sprinkle of paprika on top gave it that perfect touch of pride. It was refreshing after a plate full of fried food and rich sides. Every family had their own version. Some added onions, others celery, but the feeling was always the same. Grandparents made it ahead of time so it could chill and let the flavors come together. It was comfort in a bowl, cool and familiar as an old song. The first taste was always soft and creamy, followed by that gentle pop of relish sweetness. It brought a balance to heavy meals and a pause between bites of heat and spice. Grandparents would stir it with quiet focus, knowing everyone expected it on the table. It wasn't just about the food, it was about showing care in the details, the small touches that turned gatherings into memories. Even now, that first spoonful can take you straight back to church basements, family reunions, and long summer evenings. If any of these dishes pulled up a memory you forgot you were holding, tell me your favorite in the comments and tap like and subscribe so we can keep bringing these stories back to the table.